It'll be great to get started with our presentation this morning or this afternoon. And I know that we're looking at a fascinating topic, one that really properly would take quite a bit more than 45 minutes to talk about. So let's get started. Why don't we open with a word of prayer, and let's seek the Lord. Vinu Malkeinu, our Father and our King. Thank you for your presence with us today. Lord, we seek to know and understand you better. And I pray, Father, that your Spirit will infuse this time that we've shared together so that we are more deeply aware of the significance of what you are doing today. In Yeshua's name, amen. Amen. Now, wherever I go, there's one question people always ask me, or people pursue with me, or when people come to my congregation, there's one question which is, it's always being asked. And sometimes when I am in conversations with pastors and other leaders, there's a particular question that frequently comes up as if I might know, might be an expert, might have some particular special insight into, and that is, Ben, don't you think Yeshua is coming soon? Do you believe Yeshua is coming soon? All the things would seem to point to that. I mean, Ben, isn't it likely Yeshua is going to come soon? Well, in many ways, that really is what we're talking about today. And in order to talk about this with you, and I think this really is the point of this message. The issue is not facts. The issue is not information. The question is, what is the state of our current situation in relationship to the soon coming of Messiah? And in order to do that, I want to refer you to these words, which we are going to talk about Matthew 24 later. But listen to Yeshua's heart. Listen to what he instructs us. This is the attitude that he expects believers to have. Now, let the fig tree teach you its lesson. When its branches begin to sprout and leaves appear, you know that summer is approaching. And in the same way, when you see all these things, you are to know that the time is near, right at the door. Yes, I tell you that this people, the Jewish people, will certainly not pass away before all these things happen. Now, this is a particularly interesting verse. Some of you have heard this translated differently. This generation will not pass away. But in fact, the complete Jewish Bible translates it in such a way that we understand that Yeshua's saying that the significant events which we should be focusing on are related to the Jewish people. And he says, the Jewish people will not pass away until all these things happen. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. And then he goes on and says, but when that day and hour come, no one knows. not the angels in heaven, not the Son, only the Father. For the Son of Man's coming will be just as it was in the days of Noah. In other words, we are supposed to understand no one knows. However, it will be just like in the days of Noah. When the Son of Man comes, stay alert, because you don't know on what day your Lord will come. And so, when we hear this, we should ask ourselves, do we know what season we are in? That's why we're making this study today. We need to understand the season we are in. We should understand that there are signs in our time. What is going on in our time is significant. We live in the hour when the Messiah is still, it still seems on the horizon, and yet the reality of Israel is in the midst of the nations as has not been for thousands of years, quite literally. We live in a particularly significant hour. So we need to know we are living in a critical time. But are we careless about the things of God at this time? And are the believers around us sensitive to those issues? In fact, I think that is the compelling issue for many of us who are in this ministry, is that even though we live in the time when there's a real Israel, when God has brought people back to the land, when so many promises have been fulfilled, and I think of some of the things that we just heard. Do we take seriously what God is doing today? And then finally, this issue. Believers are less concerned about the coming of the Lord today. This is not a time when believers talk a great deal about the coming of the Lord. And so that's extremely significant. And so it leads us to ask even more deeply, is our heart tender toward the signs of his coming? So these are some of the things that I really want us to focus on. I know that it's tempting to begin to, talk about all the factual material, and there's a tremendous amount of interesting material we will talk about today, but I want us to begin with the right attitude. Is our heart tender toward the signs of his coming? And here we see the Temple Mount. Roughly as it's pictured, all these are speculative, and this is one recent, this is actually a 3D computer model which was created of the temple. And I could do these, I have I have lots of computer-generated models which are fascinating to go through. But we are going to be talking today about really what this Temple Mount area means. Because Yeshua told his disciples as they're leaving, as they're walking out of the temple, he says to them, not one stone will be left standing on another. His words are fulfilled, except that the platform on which the temple is standing remains. And this area, not the actual temple itself. The actual temple itself was not only burned by the Romans, but the stones were literally pushed off the Temple Mount area. The temple itself was destroyed. All of Jerusalem, by the way, was destroyed by the Romans. They took chains literally, and then they sowed the place with salt. They were determined to destroy the evidence of there actually having been Jerusalem, a Jewish city there. But what remains of the Temple Mount, they did not destroy because it was these huge, massive stones, many of them over many tons worth of stonework, which could not ever be moved and which has remained. Despite, by the way, and you should know this, it's fascinating and interesting detail. Jerusalem is a city that has been plagued in the past by earthquakes. And major buildings have been destroyed in the past by earthquakes and then been rebuilt. I can't get into some of that detail. By the way, Israel always remains, though they never talk about it, on an earthquake watch. They had speculated that such an earthquake could happen anytime from about 75 years ago. It's a minor point. Oh yes, has nothing to do with whether or not you should decide to visit Israel next year. Anyway, here is what we have, though. This is the Temple Mount. The Jewish people call it Har Habayit, which literally means the mountain of the house. The Arabs call it Haram al-Sharif, which means literally the Mount of the Noble Sanctuary. And it is the holiest site in Judaism. It is the third holiest site in Islam. It is sacred to Christians as the site of the last earthly ministry of Yeshua the Messiah. And of course, it is the most hotly contested piece of real estate on the globe. It is fascinating to realize that this Temple Mount is contested by three religions, all of whom think it is theirs. Absolutely. All Christians think it belongs to them. And it should be theirs. And it's just a matter of detail before that happens. So this is part of the reality. Everybody thinks this piece of territory belongs to them. Its most distinguishing features are the Dome of the Rock, which is right at the center, one of the most celebrated and highly recognizable symbols of Jerusalem. Just below it, in this particular slide, is what is called the Dome of the Chain. I'll show that to you in a moment in greater detail. And then an area called the Al-Aqsa. But you can see that this area is vast, and in fact, it is currently covered with numerous areas that have been covered over in vegetation. And we'll see another slide that shows some of the changes, but you can see here as well the traditional Al-Aqsa Mosque in the top left-hand corner. That is sometimes called the Al-Qibli Chapel, not to be confused, though it is still what they refer to usually as the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And I'll talk about these things. But notice how much vegetation is there, how much vegetation has been placed on this mount. And it looks like little orchards when you're up there. And I have a little bit more of a detailed picture here, but it basically shows you the same thing. I'll just move this slide forward for us. I have to keep refreshing my phone to do this. Yeah, this is a little bit more detailed. What's fascinating, and you'll hear this in more detail later, is that the current view, the current narrative concerning the Temple Mount from Islam is that the Jewish people had no relationship to this place, that this was a mosque always, which is fascinating. Most of you know that Islam only dates back to the 7th century, and yet they'll say, oh, this was always a mosque. And by the way, the key that they know it wasn't a mosque is partially in the fact that they call it Al-Sharif, which the noble sanctuary. It's actually a reference to the original temple. And the reason that it was so significant always to Islam was it was recognizable as the Temple of Solomon, built at the command of David. Two significant figures in Islamic history, too. Now, the major major sites that we see here. You see the dates in which they're built. The Dome of the Rock, built around 691. And that was built around 60 years after the conquest, the Muslim conquest of Jerusalem, and the Dome of the Chain. Let's take a closer look at these. And you should see that these are not small buildings. They are massive in their own right. The Dome of the Rock was actually in some ways built on the model of the Dome of the Chain. And the reason that these buildings are so elaborate is purposeful. When the Muslims first arrived, they swept through the Middle East, they swept through the areas of Egypt, Syria, they conquered this area. They were particularly interested in taking Jerusalem because they knew its significance for what they called the people of the book. And when they conquered these areas, actually the story is quite remarkable. The Byzantine Church, which controlled Jerusalem, had absolutely no respect for the Temple Mount whatsoever, and so they had actually turned this into the town dump. And the Caliph arrives, soiled after battle. He's determined to go to what he knows is and considers the holiest place in Jerusalem. And he speaks to the patriarch, the head of the church, and demands to go to the great temple. Well, the patriarch first tries to take him to the great church of the sepulchre, Holy Sepulchre, and no, that's not that important. He ends up having to take him to the town dump. The Caliph is horrified, and literally they find what he considers to be the sacred spot. And we'll talk about it, Al-Sakhra. It's the central stone on which it was said that Abraham had bound Isaac, the stone on which the Ark of the Covenant had sat. That was of tremendous interest to the Caliph. He literally bends down, it's covered with refuse, picks it up. Oh, his retinue are horrified, but it's the sign this is to be cleaned off. And he demands that the patriarch bow in reverence with him, having found the sacred place which he was seeking in Jerusalem. That's how significant this was for Islam. Now, the Dome of the Rock is not built for about 60 years, and the reason for this is that the early Islamic traditions of architecture were not very advanced. However, when they arrived in Jerusalem and settled into the city, they wanted to be able to be as elaborately impressive as the churches that surrounded them. They didn't want to be outdone by the magnificent Byzantine churches that were already there. And that's why they built this beautiful, elaborate dome, particularly over Al-Sakhra, the sacred rock. Now, it is not a mosque. Islamic people don't pray there. However, it is a place of worship. It's a place of worship, particularly concerning this place, which is still contestable as to whether or not this was the actual site of the original temple. But you've probably never been inside the Dome of the Rock, so let's take a look inside it. This is what it looks inside. This is how beautiful and elaborate it is inside the dome. So a great deal has been done specifically around what is a significant sign, significant place for Israel, and has been made specifically sacred in numerous ways for Islam. And the reason that this happened is related to lore, which was created centuries after the Prophet lived. Centuries after the Prophet Muhammad, one of the pieces of lore that came up was that he ascended to heaven from El-Sahra, that he took a midnight ride literally from Mecca all the way to Jerusalem. The accounts do not say Jerusalem, and by the way, the word Jerusalem, just as Michael Brown has said, never appears in the Quran. However, it said that he went to a distant place. The discussion about what the distant place was has become less relevant today, but actually earlier manuscripts about the lore indicate that it wasn't Jerusalem. Why did they make it Jerusalem? Well, I was telling you about some of the architecture that Islam had built up. And there was a certain point when one of the caliphs, who had poured a tremendous amount into Jerusalem to make it an elaborate place, and they were hoping that it would become a significant place for literally Islamic tourists. We're talking about the 12th century. You know that tourism was big all through the medieval period? People wouldn't visit Jerusalem. It wasn't considered important enough. They were always going to Damascus, which was just to the north, but skipping over Jerusalem. So finally, they kind of promoted the place as Al-Aqsa. They decided to turn this into the place in which Muhammad ascended. And so this became one of the interesting aspects about this place. It's the third holiest site, therefore, in Islam, because it's significant for this particular reason. And as commemoration, there is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Both actually, the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa were built originally on churches. There were churches on this site. They're probably pre-Byzantine or early Byzantine churches. However, these sites have taken on a very different kind of significance since the creation of the State of Israel. And the reason of that significance is specifically because of the State of Israel. There has grown up the need and a desire to give Jerusalem a significance for all of Islam. Now, you probably have never gone up to the Temple Mount. I hadn't experienced it myself until this past summer, but I thought you might want to experience something of the Temple Mount experience, so I brought a YouTube video we're going to try to run, and let's see how that works.
Hey there, how's it going? I'm walking over to the old city of Jerusalem here, which is only a 5 to 10 minute walk from here. Some cool graffiti here. My hostel is straight back there. And so I'm going to the Dome of the Rock right now because it has limited hours that it's open. It is open for the next hour, and so I got to get there and get inside. You have to bring your passport. It is free to enter. There will probably be a line going in, and then I will be exploring around more of the old city. There is a ridiculous amount of different things to see of incredible historic importance. Right here, you can see the old wall surrounding the old city, and up ahead is Jaffa Gate. And so today, going to explore the old city, get lost in there, go see some incredible places mentioned in the Bible and places of extreme significance to not only this region of the world, but the world in general. Jerusalem is at the center of the three Abrahamic faiths of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. That is why there is also problems here. Of course, the history is extremely complicated. I'm not going to get too deep into it. And so this is the Jaffa Gate, or Jaffa Gate, or Yafo Gate.
Could we advance to minute 4:59? Minute 4:59.
What a scene.
This isn't it. So, trying to get to okay. We should have been playing from minute 4:59 to 7:20. I would suppose. And yeah, it's prior to this.
And so I'm just going.
Minute 4:59. Should be just after the Western Wall. Four. Yes, right there. That's it.
The Muslims believe that this is where Muhammad ascended to heaven, so pretty significant. Looks like Roman architecture here. This area was also occupied by the Romans. The second temple of the Jews that was situated here was destroyed by the Romans. Okay, and there is the Dome of the Rock. Now that is not the original building that was built in 691 AD, or at least it is not the original dome. It is the original spot, and I think part of the building is the original building, but it has been renovated. The Golden Dome was added.
So you're now on this is the Temple Mount. You're on the Temple Mount. Okay, let's wrap that up. I'll move on to the next slide. Thanks. That gives you a feel for what it's like to be on the Temple Mount. You can see that it's a extremely it's an extremely compelling place in terms of the site itself, highly developed by the by what's called the Waqf, which was the actual that's the body that oversees it's kind of like the Islamic nonprofit organization that oversees the Temple Mount. It's got that very unusual name, WAQF, WAQF. Consider that for the Islamic peoples, the significance of Jerusalem is tremendous. So many times, if you talk to a person of this background, they will bring up distant past events. The Crusades are particularly significant for them. The Crusades, which were fought over Jerusalem largely, and Saladin, the great victor over the Crusaders, is still held dear in the Islamic heart because of his significance. So imagine what it means for them that in 1917, the British drove the Turks out and then brought in a British mandate, a mandate to create a Jewish state. This is one of the most incredibly significant moments for their history, but they could not fully comprehend it because in Islamic theology, no land that has ever belonged to Islam really can be other. It should not be sold. It should not be given to anyone else but someone who is of Islamic heritage or within their faith. So the entrance of Allenby into Jerusalem, December 1917, this is an incredible change in history. And then the creation of the state of Israel is for them, as Dr. Michael Brown was saying, for them it's called Nakba. It's a disaster that this small as Israel is, it is a disaster for them. In 1948, as soon as the state is declared, they go to war against Israel. But one of the aspects of this war that is so difficult for the Jewish people and was one of the most bitter pills for Israel to swallow, particularly for Ben-Gurion, was the painful loss and the division of Jerusalem. The Jewish quarter, the area that the Jewish people had lived in for many centuries, was destroyed, and in many ways, every attempt was made by the Jordanian forces that took over Jerusalem in 1948 to remove any evidence of Jewish people having occupied even an area that belonged to Jewish people for centuries. So in post-1948, the Jewish quarter in which sits the Temple Mount, that is what we call the Old City, that is the original city of Jerusalem, as it was for centuries, the Jewish quarter was not only taken over, but it was largely destroyed by the Jordanians, and the Temple Mount was particularly significant. It was a particularly important piece of property that the Jordanians controlled after 1948. Jerusalem was a divided city. Nevertheless, Ben-Gurion insisted there can be no other capital for the state of Israel than Jerusalem, and he moved all the major elements of a nation, and he insisted that they be built, and largely they were built in West Jerusalem as a result of that. But the trail of destruction, again, we're talking about the two sides of the coin that Dr. Brown was talking about. On one side, the memory of Islam is Nakba, the creation of a state of Israel. For Jewish people, the destruction of the Jewish quarter is remembered equally as well. And that meant the destruction, the desecrated graves on the Mount of Olives, for them also. During the destruction of the Hurva synagogue, which was the largest synagogue of the Jewish quarter. It was destroyed along with 58 synagogues and yeshivas. This was what had happened. This was the memory of the Jewish people concerning the Temple Mount after 1948 until 1967. So really, a generation grew up, and this was extremely significant for this generation that grew up with no contact with the Western Wall, what we call the Kotel, the holiest site in Jerusalem, the holiest site in Israel, the holiest site in Judaism, was inaccessible. Now, in the original 1947 plan for the partition of the State of Israel, Jerusalem was supposed to become an international city. In other words, all the holy sites were supposed to be accessible to all faiths. That was the original concept. As soon as the Jordanians, of course, took over the old city, took over the Jewish quarter, took over the Temple Mount, and the Western Wall, which previously had been overseen by the British Mandate, they completely, of course, cut off any Jewish access. And a generation of Israelis grow up, and they are literally looking at the Temple Mount from a far distance. All they can see are literally, you see those trees? Israelis used to talk to each other about, we stood on rooftops and just looked over at what for us was the holiest site in all of Israel, all the whole Jewish world. This is the holy. We couldn't get there. The significance then of 1967 cannot be minimized for this, for this generation and for my generation as well. The battle for Jerusalem was not an insignificant and was not an easy battle. Now, I did an entire and very extensive presentation on this last year, and you can find that on another YouTube site that's accessible along with this video. So I won't review all that material, but the point is this was a very tough battle, June 6th and 7th, 1967, almost exactly 51 years ago. And this very, very challenging battle, a battle that originally the Israelis didn't want to have to do. This battle transforms the whole situation. And our view of what the future looks like is partially shaped by what happened in 1967. Because the Jewish forces are able to take the Temple Mount. They're able to seize this area for the first time in a generation. And that transforms everything. I can't help myself. You notice that I didn't start out with a joke, right? I never like to start a presentation with a joke, but I can't resist telling a little story that used to be very commonly told. It's not as commonly known today, but it involves this very compelling picture, which is the three heads of the IDF responsible for the battle entering Jerusalem. In the middle is General Moshe Dayan, who at that time was Minister of Defense. To his right, you see Yigal Yadin, and he is the one who literally oversaw the IDF forces during the battles. And to his left, you see General Uzi Narkis, who is responsible for the battalions which entered the city. Just above them, by the way, is a famous picture. That's the picture of Mota Gur, who's the commander of the battalions, and he is literally issuing the order to enter the old city. To the left, you see that that is the moment when the Israelis blast through St. Stephen's Gate and enter the old city for the first time. It's a very significant historical moments. But anyway, there's a story in which President Lyndon Johnson is looking at this picture in Life magazine in 1967, and he's on the phone with the Israeli Prime Minister. And at the time, you remember that the Americans were fighting a very different battle, not so successfully, in a place called Vietnam. And so Johnson says to Eshkol, you know, Levy, I'm in such a generous mood. Why don't we trade generals for a while? And Eshkol says, Mr. President, of course. What did you have in mind? He said, well, I was thinking maybe I would get these three guys, Diane, Narkis, and Yadin. How's that sound? And Eshkol says, that's a great idea. And in exchange, we'll take 3 generals from you. And Johnson says, great. Which generals do you want? Of course, he's expecting him to say Westmoreland, et cetera, et cetera. And Eshkol says, we'll take General Motors, General Electric, and General Mills. Anyway, this is perhaps the most significant point about 1967 for Jewish people. Even today, this is the moment at which the man, Shlomo Goren, he was at the time the chief chaplain of the Israeli forces, and later he will be chief rabbi of Israel. But Shlomo Goren arrives at the Western Wall, and he declares that he is he is blowing the shofar for the first time, really, in a generation. Now, you should also know a little story that is included in Randall Price's book, which is a very interesting book, The Last Days, the Last Days Temple, which I highly recommend. Apparently, one of the things that Shlomo Goren told General Uzi Narkis to do is blow up the Dome of the Rock. But he didn't. Narkis knew that that was absolutely a non-starter. But that was the mindset of Shlomo Goren at the time. And there would have been a lot of Israelis who would have not been unhappy if Narkis had done what Goren had said. But he doesn't. Instead, the major thing that takes place is the Israeli reaction and the worldwide Jewish reaction to this freeing of the most significant Jewish site in the world, the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall. This is the site closest to the ancient temple to which Jewish people can come and worship. That's why it's so significant. Now, they don't want necessarily to go on the Temple Mount, and certain Jewish authorities had forbidden them to go on the Temple Mount for a number of reasons. One reason certainly is because nobody knows really where the original Holy of Holies was. Now, El Sacra is supposedly the site of the Holy of Holies. El Sacra supposedly is where the Ark of the Covenant sat at the holiest place, where the high priest only went once a year. And even then, if you remember, the high priest, by tradition, I don't know how true the tradition is, that when he went into the Holy of Holies, they actually had something around his waist in case he were to be struck dead by God. He could be pulled out so that there wouldn't be a body left in the Holy of Holies. Again, the fact is, nobody knows where that is really. Secondly, there are those who believe that you should access it. So it's a discussion. As a result, there are very mixed feelings, but no mixed feelings concerning the resurrection, literally, of an entire unified city of Jerusalem. By the way, in 1980, Israel declares Jerusalem an entire unified city. But the effect, what Abba Ibn called the Jerusalem effect, the consequence of suddenly having, literally, as the commander said, arriving at the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount is in our hands. That statement is one of the most important, significant, historic statements literally now in Jewish history. Of course, when they arrived, they didn't know actually how to get to the actual site that they were looking for. And there's a whole curious story, which I unfortunately don't have time for, but they literally couldn't find the kotel. It was hidden actually in a back alley. One of the first things that the Jewish people do, and by the way, it's still a sore point for the Palestinian people, was they cleared all the housing that was in front of that, the kotel. They cleared it all away and created this huge plaza so that as many Jewish people as possible could literally go and access this holy place, which had been hidden from them, literally made inaccessible for a generation. Now, as we consider what this moment meant, we have to realize that within a few weeks, Moshe Dayan, who really was the key architect of what would take place next, gave the Waqf control back of the Temple Mount. Dayan's decision continues to be highly, highly contested, and is an interesting discussion that continues in Israel to this day. He had specific reasons, and the leadership of Israel had reasons for going along with him. First of all, Dayan himself had great respect for the Palestinian people. Secondly, for many people, like Dayan, who is highly secular, the importance of the Temple Mount was not the same as it was for the religious. The accepted principle of the Israelis also was, we will not treat them, we will not treat the Palestinians, we will not treat the Islamic, those people of Islam who had treated us a certain way over the last many centuries. We will not treat them as we were treated. This was a common view. This was a particular point made by soldiers as they dealt with the local populace after the Battle of Jerusalem was over. We will not treat them as they treated us. And then lastly, there was concern for the long-term potential of peace, and that having the right attitude towards such a significant Islamic site would, in a very important way, lay groundwork for future peace. Now, of course, we live in a time where some of those prospects for peace seem to have faded much more severely, and the Temple Mount remains a place of frequent demonstrations, and it is a place of frequent angry responses. This is a place where you might say it's the focal point of Islamic refusal and denial of Israel foments and seems to be at its center. And there's a reason for this. Since 1929, long before the birth of the State of Israel, since 1929, the key leaders of the community, the Islamic community in Israel, have declared that the reason they had to resist Zionism is because it was an assault on Al-Aqsa. This is an attempt by the Zionists to take control of our third holiest site. This is a frontal assault on Al-Aqsa. Now, it's interesting because the official 1925 Supreme Muslim Council, that's the official term for the Waqf, guidebook to the Temple Mount proudly states its connection to the temple built by Solomon. And literally, if you were to have gotten that 1925 guidebook issued by that Supreme Council, it would have actually referred to 2 Samuel 24:25, specifically connecting this place to the original Temple of Solomon. Now, of course, they deny that there is any connection at all. And since the 1950s, as they have produced new guidebooks, all of these now state there was never any Jewish temple there. There was never any connection between this place and the Jewish people. It was always a mosque. In fact, there's that insistence. There is no connection between the Temple Mount, this holy place, and the Jewish people. They will say, well, the Jewish people came through here like every other people, but they are of no significance. Now, this is a picture of this large black and white picture shows you how the Temple Mount looked in the 1930s. You'll notice how much of it is bare. Remember that other picture that we showed? A lot of it was covered with trees. That's a more current picture up in the corner. That's a traditional postcard view of Al-Aqsa. You'll notice, of course, that it is not covered in gold. That's a much more recent innovation, which the Arab peoples brought in. But the importance of Al-Aqsa remains for them, and they are not supposed to make any changes to the site without consulting the Israeli authorities. Of course, they do it all the time. And numerous additions have been made to the Mount specifically to erase any evidence that they have found of a Jewish temple having been on this site. That is one of the reasons why they have made certain changes. One of the major alterations that they made to the Temple Mount was that they brought up bulldozers as they created a new extra mosque in an area well known to archaeologists as Solomon's Stables. It was an area just inside and rather hidden for us in the Al-Aqsa area, and they literally bulldozed areas where archaeologists wanted to go with toothbrushes. And as a result of this, they dumped all the major Second Temple material they found into dump trucks and brought it to a civic dump. The Israelis realized what was happening. They seized the material and they created what is called the sifting project. The sifting project literally was years of sifting through all that material which had been literally scraped out of the Temple Mount. The sifting project, interestingly enough, continues, but it continues for the sake of sifting material from all kinds of archaeological projects around Jerusalem. Let me continue here. the other point here is that the authorities continue to make this the emphasis, defending Al-Aqsa. Now, my wife and I were in a tour group on July 7th, walking around the Temple Mount, kind of the area that you saw. At the same time, there was an Israeli cabinet minister who was also doing a little tour. As she did her tour, by the way, there were Israelis walking right behind the whole entourage. It was a quiet little entourage going quietly through the Temple Mount area, and they were filming the whole thing. Later, the Muslim authorities said that there was another Israeli attempt to take hold of the Temple Mount, but the Islamic authorities were able to make sure that this did not happen. It turned out that they were referring to this person just making a tour, quite literally, of the Temple Mount area. So we are still dealing with the fact that there is such tremendous resistance to the Jewish narrative. By the way, many Palestinian people are not aware of the significance of the Kotel for Jewish people. They think that Jewish people go there. They don't understand necessarily that they are praying. They are told that Jewish people are declaring other things other than prayer as they go to that place. Now, this occupied Palestine resolution was something that Mitch referred to, and this was specifically a resolution promoted by these Arab states, as you see here, which condemned Israel, alleged aggression against the Palestinian people for failing to protect the exclusive Muslim use of the Temple Mount. And it was this particular resolution which was so painful because it suggested that there had really never been any Jewish presence on the Mount. Now, I'm just going to go through some of the material that gives us an understanding of the Jewish that gives us some perspective on the Jewish understanding of a future temple. And I can only do this very briefly. The temple that is expected to be built, a future temple is expected to be built by Jewish people. And they know this because of Zechariah chapter 6, which speaks specifically of the coming of a man whose name is Branch. Branch is another name for the Messiah. And he will build the Lord's temple, and he will be clothed in splendor. And this vision of a future temple is held continually by the Jewish people, and this is one of its specific signs. Zechariah 14 continues on the same vein because we read at the end of Zechariah, the prophet, that literally sacrifices will continue in Jerusalem. Everyone who sacrifices will come. So it definitely intimates a future temple. Now, our understanding is that there is a future temple to be built, that there will be a temple built. We are anticipating a temple which has been promised to us through Daniel. Yeshua seems to affirm that there will be a future temple before he comes again. This is affirmed by Paul the Apostle and John as well in Revelation. So all these speak essentially to the building of a temple, but each one of them suggests that this temple is going to be a desecrated temple. Something's going to happen there which will not be conducive to the temple's long use as a sacred place. It will be a desecrated place. Specifically in Daniel, we see this instruction concerning what we can call the tribulation week, in which a figure will arise who will put a stop to sacrifice an offering, and the term abomination of desolation will be on a wing of the temple. I've used here the HCSB translation. We see that Yeshua also uses the same language when you see the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place. Again, it speaks of a desecration. We're not exactly sure what it means, whether or not it is some kind of desecration, the creation of an idol, but obviously it will desecrate this holy place. Paul affirms that this will be the act of what he calls the Antichrist, the man of lawlessness, who will exalt himself and literally make himself God, which, by the way, was not uncommon for leaders of that period. And Revelation also suggests that there is a sanctuary before the coming of Messiah. Now, I want us to I want us to run a presentation on the third temple, which was created by the Temple Institute. I don't think we have time for that right now. What's that? No, we're not going to run it. We're not going to run it. I'm just going to show you some pictures from the building of the third temple. If you have time, I think we can run it afterwards, okay? If people want to stay and see it. But I want to get through our presentation. These are some of the things that are happening right now because Jewish people are preparing for the rebuilding of a temple. And there is this group of people, which Dr. Brown referred to, who are literally spearheading the rebuilding of a temple now. They've revived a Sanhedrin in order to create the circumstances in which a rebuilt temple will be pursued. Secondly, they have also declared that redemption can only take place when a temple is rebuilt, so they are tremendously committed to it. As the director of the Temple Mount Faithful puts it, building a temple is an act which must be done to complete the redemption of the people of the Bible in the land of Israel. Another leader says the Shekinah, that is the Spirit itself, is brought about only through the temple. In terms of our mission as a people, we cannot in any way reach our spiritual status without the temple. This expectation then is literally a parallel discussion to what Christians were going through when they asked the question, will Israel return without the Messiah coming? And this is still the question. Is a temple to be rebuilt without the Messiah? Israel is now saying yes. These leaders are saying yes, let's consider building this temple even now. And they have initiated very specific projects, planting a biblical forest, developing a red heifer from Israeli domestic cattle, even holding reenactments of temple ceremonies and building the elements and tools for a temple. New scientific developments have carried this further. They recently found the dye, which is used in the garments of the high priest and for the temple veil, that specific red which you see in the temple veil. Now, why would a temple be sanctified for sacrifice if Yeshua is the final sacrifice? This is one of the key questions. There are three possible answers for this. Perhaps it could be a sacred model for understanding the nature and practice of sacrifice. Perhaps we would be like the Talmudim, who went to the temple for 40 years, well, as long as the temple stood after the death of Yeshua. And thirdly, because it would truly challenge the Islamic and Christian views that they have superseded Judaism. The Israeli Supreme Court has literally stepped away from this question. Let's look at what they have declared on the issue of the works on the Temple Mount. This is one of those cases in which a judicial ruling is not the reasonable way to decide the dispute. And a decision of this kind goes beyond the boundaries of the law It is the political echelon and not the court that must give content and meaning to the historic call. The Temple Mount is ours. So even the Israeli Supreme Court is stepping away from this problem. So is it conceivable that a temple would be built? Joe Rosenberg, in his book Epicenter, suggests some reasons how it could happen. Perhaps supernatural judgments might happen on these architectural, on these great pieces of architecture on the mount. Perhaps literally fire will rain down from heaven on the dome of the mount and destroy it. Secondly, natural disasters. An earthquake might destroy everything that's on the Temple Mount. Particularly, this is one of the questions that will happen if there will be another battle for Jerusalem. And certainly, when we look back to the battles of 2005, when more than 1,000 rockets a day were falling on Israel from Hezbollah in Lebanon, is there not the possibility that one of them would strike the Dome of the Mount, the Dome of the Rock? And then this is the other scenario which Rosenberg has suggested. Perhaps if there is a major war, and he puts it in the context of the war of Gog and Magog, in the post-war peace, there would be a desire for coexistence, which would lead to the allowance of the building of a temple on the Temple Mount next to whatever holy sites would remain of Islam. Now, it's hard for us to really know whether or not that's possible. And I just want to point this out. This is probably one of the most significant aspects of this. If there is another battle for Jerusalem, the attitude of Israel toward the Temple Mount will not be what it was in 1967. And that will make all the difference. I need to point out just a few other things before I wrap up. Is it so inconceivable that the temple will not be rebuilt? It is just exactly almost 101 years ago, almost exactly 101 years ago, that the Turks were driven out of Jerusalem, and they had been there for hundreds and hundreds of years. And while the British cabinet was deciding specifically that they were going to create a British mandate for a Jewish state, on October 31st, 1917, the last great battles for Israel were being won. The Allies advanced on Jerusalem on December 8th, again, almost exactly 101 years ago. They fled Jerusalem, and on December 9th, 1917, as the Turkish army was evacuating Jerusalem, the Jewish people were lighting the first lights of Hanukkah, which were the sign of the remembrance of the restoration of the temple 2,000 years. My friends, fact is, do we know what seasons we are in? That is the critical issue. Do we understand the times we're in? We are actually in times which suggest there are things going on which will prepare for the coming of Messiah. We need to think not in terms of the specifics, but rather in terms of ourselves, our hearts. Because around us, the world will reject whatever Israel does. The world will reject, deny, and put up whatever obstacles they can. But we must be ready. We must be ready. Because Yeshua is coming. The circumstances before will be challenging. Let's pray. Thank you, Lord, that you are leading your people through these times. Your Spirit is present with us. Father, we need to remember the words of Yeshua in Matthew 13. He was the one who said specifically concerning these matters that we should know not only what times we are in, but we should be ready and we should be aware of what our Heavenly Father is doing now. He says this is why he tells stories, to create readiness, to nudge the people towards receptive insight in their present state. He says, you have been blessed. A lot of people, prophets, humble believers among them, would have given anything to see what you are seeing, to hear what you're hearing, but never had the chance. That's the times we're in. For thousands of years, people yearn to see what we are seeing. The preparations of the coming of Messiah. Let us be ready. Let our hearts be ready. And let us be open to what you will do next. In Yeshua's name, amen. Let's run that video.